During this segment, Marisa and Chris will plan for the hearing in front of the Immigration Court on the merits of the asylum claim. First, we'll see them as they prepare their document submission that they plan to file in court in a few days. They'll be finalizing their legal theory and putting everything together in documents that will be submitted to court. The legal submission will include a legal brief, an affidavit, affidavits by witnesses, substantial country background information, and identification documents of the client and other original documents. Pay attention to the conversations that the lawyers have about submitting original documents to court. Then you'll see Marisa and Chris as they prepare Fatima for her testimony. When lawyers are preparing for testimony in court, they need to consider two factors. One, the facts that they need to prove in order to establish their legal theory. And also, they want to be concerned with establishing their client's credibility. Oftentimes, lawyers overlook the value of preparing witnesses for direct, and particularly cross-examination. And as a result, many cases end up faltering because the witnesses either say something that's inconsistent or inaccurate, or they don't understand the legal theory of the case. Therefore, Marisa and Chris will spend substantial time working with Fatima and their other witnesses in oral testimony before the hearing in a few days.
Okay, let's talk about the brief a little bit so we're on the same page. You know, I think there are different ways that we can show that she meets the statutory definition of refugee for purposes of asylum eligibility. I think, you know, we definitely have a subjective and a subjective fear of persecution. It's objectively reasonable, as defined by the case law, that a reasonable person in her circumstances would fear persecution. The persecution that we're showing is, you know, severe enough to constitute persecution,
right.
As well as, you know, severe abuse and harm. And then I'll get into the nexus. You know.
Well, we should probably also talk about the objective fear, the factors that pertain to an objective fear of persecution as well.
Right, and I think I cited those in the brief.
Right.
There are four
factors. Yeah,
okay,
there's
under matter of
Mogarabi.
Okay.
Right. That that Fatima has a characteristic that the persecutor is aware of, seeks to overcome by punishing, is aware of it, and is inclined and capable
of punishing. Definitely.
Okay.
I think, you know, since we're showing that the persecution is by the government, we don't have to show that the threat is countrywide.
In other words, we don't have to show that she would have been safer moving somewhere else in the country. Okay.
Right.
Well, great.
And then in terms of the theories of persecution, I mean, I think we have a good case for her to be granted asylum based on past persecution alone under matter of Chen and the pertinent regulation, which I wrote down here, 208.13b12.
And that's interesting because one of the things we talked about earlier on in the case was whether what she suffered, specifically, you know, the rape, would constitute persecution. So your research indicated that it would constitute.
There are published cases indicating that rape can constitute past persecution, as well as her detention and deprivations and punishment and torture in detention could constitute past persecution alone without a well-founded fear of future persecution. So, you know, I think that's one basis. And as you know, we only have to show for asylum eligibility under Supreme Court precedent just a 10% risk of future persecution.
Right, a
so
1 in 10 chance.
A 1 in 10 chance of persecution. For withholding of removal, the companion remedy, which is mandatory, not discretionary, there we have to show an over 50% likelihood of future persecution, but I think we can meet that as well. I think the other thing I wanted to do that I did in the brief was really emphasize that the court should take notice and apply the children's asylum guidelines, because she still is a child. The persecution that she suffered was as a child. These asylum guidelines are not binding on the immigration court. They're binding on the Department of Homeland Security in affirmative cases. But, you know, the court can take notice of them and try to understand the persecution from the perspective of the child applicant.
And in addition to the children's guidelines or the gender guidelines, which I think would also apply in this
Definitely.
case.
If we're allowed to do an opening statement, you know, we'll want to refer to the children's asylum guidelines as well as the gender guidelines and alert them to the sensitivity of the case.
Right.
We have great evidence to establish the past persecution theory, both the medical reports, you know, which show the torture that she suffered, as well as the mental health report that has a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. So that's great objective evidence that's going to support the past persecution theory.
And the facts to prove chart was a good tool in coming up with, you know, what evidence we want to use.
Yeah, and we do. We've got an abundance of evidence to present in this case. I don't know how we're going to do it in a one-day or a few-hour hearing.
Yeah.
In terms of, you know, the theories that I thought, the big issue we're going to have in this case is, you know, how it was persecution on account of one of the 5 enumerated grounds. So I wanted to go over with you sort of
let's go through each one.
Where I thought we were at. Okay. In terms of race or race, you know, we could argue that she experienced and faces persecution by virtue of her racial background as a Malinke.
Right, her tribal membership.
Her tribal membership. You know, I'm not sure if the Malinke membership would be better to sort of include as particular social group, as a more discrete class, than under the rubric of race, but I do think we should try to argue it under race as well. And then in terms of religion, that's not relevant.
No.
Nationality, that's not relevant. So then we're into the land of political opinion. And I think we have both actual and imputed political opinion, because as you know, our client has attested, she has participated in political activities against the government there with the opposition party, and she has strong political convictions because of the opposition party. And I think that the government is aware of, you know, of her opposition, even though she never told her persecutors, I am opposed to you per se, but by virtue of her family membership as well as her Malinke membership, they are definitely imputing a political opinion to her that's contrary to, you know, President Conte's regime.
Right, especially since her uncle is such a prominent member of the opposition, and they are imputing his political opinion onto her as well.
Right. So I think, you know, in terms of the in terms of political opinion and past persecution, it'll be iffy to establish that it was her actual political opinion that triggered the persecution that she suffered.
Right.
It looks more like a case of imputed political opinion there. In terms of going back in the future and her future risk, you know, now that she's so committed to, you know, opposing the government and has demonstrated her opposition to the government, I think we have a case of, you know, that she would be persecuted based on her actual political opinion and her imputed political opinion.
And speaking of her family, that would also be a social group. I think we can also make the argument.
Yeah, there's great case law on family as a particular social group under asylum law. There are several circuit court decisions that stand for that proposition. So she was definitely being, you know, targeted and would be targeted because of her membership in, you know, in the family. One issue that could come up with that is that, you know, those cases really look at the nuclear family, and we have this issue with
extended family,
with the extended family and extended kinship. Because, you know, it was her uncle, but her uncle is really kind of a distant cousin. So But he was playing the de facto...
He was a father figure,
exactly.
Yeah.
He was de facto father.
Right, I think we could make that argument.
Yeah, to carve it in terms of, in an immediate family, under social group analysis. Then in terms of discretionary factors, the issue that we're going to have is she did try to enter with a fraudulent visa. And that can pose some issues because under a case called Matter of Pula, which is a Board of Immigration Appeals opinion, in absent any negative factors, discretion should be exercised for an asylum seeker. Now, the one factor that they cite as a potential negative factor is immigration fraud, entering with fraudulent documents.
But I believe they hold that entering with a false U.S. passport is severe fraud, whereas coming in with another country's travel document is not nearly as egregious.
Right.
And they make that distinction.
They make that distinction, but it is something that, I think what we want to do with the fraud issue is really show that she didn't have the mens rea to commit fraud at the time that she entered. That she was not even aware of the immigration papers that she was using when she was coming to the country.
Let me just make sure I'm clear on the whole discretionary aspect of this. Even if our client meets the definition of a refugee and satisfies all the elements for asylum, the judge still has discretion not to grant asylum. A number of factors could influence the judge's decision in that regard.
Right, and that's why I've heard that some judges, it's much harder to get them to grant asylum, and you can get withholding of removal, which is a higher standard of proof, more than a 50% risk of persecution. But that's mandatory. The withholding is mandatory. The asylum is discretionary, and some judges aren't as inclined to, grant asylum even with a lesser standard of proof because they don't want to be countenancing immigration fraud.
And not only would we have to meet a higher standard, but she would also receive fewer benefits from withholding of removal.
Yeah, withholding is not the remedy that we want in this case. I mean, if they were willing, one thing to think about, if they're willing to stipulate at the beginning of the hearing to withholding of removal, that's something we can consider. It's a risky proposition, but I think all things being considered, we'd prefer to have asylum. She can then get a green card. She can become a U.S. citizen.
And I think that's really important for this client.
Yeah, I agree. Withholding is too tenuous a remedy.
Yeah, especially for someone that young. She could really make a future for herself here.
Under the discretionary factors, though, we have the fraud issue, but we've got a lot of really positive factors that I think we want to emphasize.
Such as her age,
Such as her age, such as the severity of the persecution, the continued treatment she's receiving with the psychologist that, wouldn't readily be available in Guinea if she returns. So, there are compelling humanitarian reasons for which she deserves a grant of asylum under discretionary factors. The statutory bars, I don't see any statutory bar for eligibility for asylum because she has no criminal convictions. She didn't participate in...
quickly list them. There are criminal activity.
A particularly serious crime. If it's a particularly serious crime, that can bar you from eligibility.
Firm resettlement in another country.
Right. She came directly here, so we're okay. As well as participation in persecution.
That's clearly not an issue in this case.
Clearly not an issue. I think, the issues that are going to come up in terms of our legal theory with the Department of Homeland Security, I'm kind of concerned that they're going to just say that, this was a case of legitimate law enforcement activities, that they have a right to monitor the activities of opposition parties, and they took her in and interrogated her as an incident to legitimate law enforcement.
Well, luckily we have a number of reports that would kind of knock that argument right out of the water.
Such as?
Such as the State Department report that talks about the abuses that the government inflicts on opposition members, and it definitely doesn't in any way seem to condone what goes on in Guinea against the opposition. And our country expert will also testify that the the conditions in Guinea, the actions against the opposition are just completely beyond anything that could be construed as legitimate law enforcement.
Yeah, the other thing I'm a little worried about is, as usual, is the nexus issue, because we always have to show with direct or circumstantial evidence that the persecution was on account of one of these protected grounds. With the Malinke issue, they were pretty clear that they were targeting her because of Malinke.
Right, they were calling her Dirty Malinke and other insults and
that shows that the
humiliating
persecution was
terms.
account of it. They were looking for her uncle. And her uncle was a political activist. That, I think, also evidences that it was, due to her family relationship, as well as, imputed political opinion. And they did make allegations against her about, the Malinkes supporting the opposition effort.
Right.
So they did actually view her as a dissident by virtue of her Malinke membership, despite the fact that they apparently weren't aware that she had been going to these different political functions. The other thing I'm concerned about is I've heard that the Department of Homeland Security now has been doing a lot of forensic testing of evidence, and we've got all of these original documents from Guinea, and we haven't had them tested, to my knowledge, but I'm worried they're going to come back and say that they don't believe that they're legit.
Yes, and I did ask them about a month ago if they wanted to test these documents, and they said no, but they always have the option of seeing them, in court and then saying, what, upon looking at this document, I'd like to have this case continued so that we can have them forensically tested. So we can hope that they don't do that, and we could object if they do, because we did give them an opportunity. And what's
their legal authority to do forensic testing?
I thought there is a regulation that discusses authentication, and it's based on that. And then, since asylum cases turn so much on credibility, documenting who a person really is and whether the documents they're producing are legitimate has become extremely important.
Do you think we need to try to get them tested?
I think we should look into that. I mean, there are organizations that do that. Yeah, but I did hear of one organization that does them at low cost. Then we can look them up and see if they'd be willing to do that.
And finally, she is also eligible for protection under Article 3 of the United Nations Convention Against Torture. If she fears or has experienced torture at the hands of the government in her country.
That's similar to withholding under the Immigration and Nationality Act, right?
Exactly. It would give her the same benefits of withholding, which means that they just won't deport her and will allow her to stay, but they could always try to deport her at some time by rescinding the withholding. It's not a great remedy. I think, though, she does have a pretty good case for protection under the Torture Convention because the rape does constitute a form of torture that she experienced. And the benefit of Torture Convention is that unlike, asylum and withholding where we have this nexus that we have to prove, it can be torture for any, illicit purpose.
As long as it's a government actor. Or government acquiescence. Exactly,
and here we have direct government actor. So, it's just a backup remedy that I will also be prepared to argue, and I include, her eligibility in the brief.
Okay, great.
So what else
I think we should go through the direct examination. I can go see if she's here, bring her in, and we can get started with that.
Okay, great.
We just wanted to start to tell you about court and what's going to happen at court and practice a few questions with you. We're going to be asking questions to you. You'll be sitting on the witness stand next to the judge. We'll probably be sitting at our desk in front of the judge. and asking you questions.
Okay.
And we've prepared a lot of questions for you that we have a copy for you, because you've got to be able to answer questions by the judge, questions by the trial attorney. We want you to feel comfortable. We don't want you to be nervous and freeze up.
Okay.
You know, whereas if you memorize this like a script, it's not going to work. We need you to be able to be candid, forthcoming, and spontaneous, but it'll help you to go through this, because you'll understand why we're asking questions of you.
Okay.
Now we're going to go through the questions with you, and we're going to be stopping you and going over your answers. This is so that we can help to refine your answers so that the judge hears what's really important, and so that your story gets out in a really clear way. Okay? So it's not because you're answering them wrong, it's just that there's a certain way that they should be answered. So let's get started with a few questions, okay? We'll start with some of the easy ones. Okay, you ready?
Mm-hmm.
What's your name?
Fatima Touré,
And when were you born?
July 4th,
Where?
in Conakry, in Guinea,
Okay. Why did you flee Guinea?
because my life was in danger and I was afraid that the government would continue to harm me,
Okay. Why did the government harm you?
because my family is involved in politics and my uncle is trying to change the government, is working to change the government.
Okay.
Any other reasons why the government sought to harm you?
Yes, because I am Malinke.
Right. Try to remember to tell us about that too when we ask you.
If you don't answer all the questions fully, it's our job to try to help you
Right.
to answer them. So that's why I did that follow-up question right now.
Okay.
But the more complete you are in your answers, the more helpful it will be for us, because we can only ask follow-up questions on the answers that you provide in
Right.
court.
Okay.
So you establish the facts for us, and then we keep asking more questions.
Okay.
Yeah, we can only help you out to a certain extent with our questions. If we help you out too much, then the judge won't let us ask the question and he won't let you answer it. For example, we can say, and one of my questions will be, were you ever harmed? And you could say yes, and I'll follow up with the question. I can't say, were you beaten and tortured?
Okay.
I won't be allowed to ask that. What I can say is, how were you harmed? And then you can tell me the answer. So let's go on with some more questions,
Sounds
shall we?
great.
Okay. What exactly is Malinke?
Malinke is my ethnicity. It is the second largest ethnic group in Guinea.
Okay. And who are your parents?
My mother's name is Waida Touré, and my father's name is Malik Touré.
And your uncle?
His name is Lamine Touré.
Okay. And how are you related to him?
He is a distant cousin of my father's.
Okay. And what's your relationship with him?
He came to support my family after my father died, and he
Remember when you told us about him, what did you call him?
my father.
Exactly.
Yeah, you can say that he was like a father to you. He was my adopted father, even.
Because he supported you, he helped you and your family members, he lived with you, he was like your father.
Right. Okay. Let's skip ahead to the second time that you were attacked at home.
Okay.
Okay. You said that after the first time you were arrested at home, that the next time you weren't so lucky. What are you referring to?
Because that time when they arrested me, that's when I was harmed.
Okay. Tell us what happened that day. Where were you?
I was in the yard playing with my cousin, and then I saw the jeep coming up to my house, and I went inside to tell my mother that there's a jeep the Jeep is coming.
Well, what was it about this Jeep?
It was the same Jeep as the last time of the presidential guard.
Okay.
And that's why I went to tell my mother, because I recognized the Jeep.
And then what happened?
And then 4 of the presidential guard, they came out of the Jeep with guns, and they came up to my house, and they came inside and they started to ask where is my uncle, where they wanted to know where he was. And they asked my mother, and we could not tell them because we did not know.
What exactly did they say?
They said, where is your uncle? Where is Mr. Toure?
Okay. When you're talking about what people said, you want to be as accurate as possible, because in your declaration, we have in your declaration, where is Lamine? Tell us where he is.
Okay.
So, you want to be able to have it like this is exactly what they said.
Okay.
Okay.
Did they say anything else?
No, they asked my aunt, they talked to my mother, and my mother did not know either, and my aunt did not know either. They said racial slurs.
Okay.
They called us names. I don't remember specifically what they said, but they said dirty malenke. I don't remember the other stuff that they said.
Okay, well, that's going to be very important because it shows what their motivation was.
So what happened next?
And when we ask those what happened next, that's a way for you to keep moving with all the details of what's happening. You're doing wonderfully. The abuse is critical in your case because we're showing that you suffered severe persecution, severe harm. So this is where you want to be as detailed as possible about what happened, how long it took, how you felt, all of the reactions, so that you can bring us in as if we're right there in the room and we're seeing what's happening to you and we're saying, how can this be happening? This is so horrible.